Welcome everyone for the afternoon session on the future of money. Perhaps one of the most important topics that I have run into in recent times, especially something that I've moderated in recent times. And I think this couldn't have come at a more apt time. This is a topic which I think in the post-pandemic world is going to be something where we are going to notice, we are going to see that just like everything, just like there are huge paradigm shifts in learning, livelihood, work, and so on that's happening in the pandemic world, we are going to see that the way we transact and the way we interact on the monetary front is also going to be changing pretty radically as we move out of the pandemic into the post-pandemic world. It's going to be enabled not just by changes in our habits that we've got accustomed to. It's also going to be enabled by unusual collaborations between tech and between medicine and the way we interact in emergencies and in non-emergency items. So where does money come into that whole equation? I think it's going to be one of the most important elements of how we as a society pay for things that we consume. And we are going to notice that not only is the interactions are not only are the interactions going to be domestic anymore. I think that they're going to be truly global. As we can see right now, here we are. We all are from different parts of the world, zooming in right now and interacting with each other. This is exactly how it's going to be. So for me, as I moderate this panel, I really want to stress to the panel, to the really a star panel that I have right now on this program today, that yes, you might have started out as an Indian company, but going forward, it is absolutely crucial that you think of yourselves and your company as a global player, because this is where the world is heading. And for a change, India is going to have to take a leadership role in this, because we have enormous talent pool that is ready to globalize. So what I'm going to do is just give a couple of lines about myself and then start out by having each of you speak about yourself and your company and the vision for your company in the post-pandemic world. So I am Asha Jadeja Motwani, and yes, if it rings a bell, yes, I am Professor Rajiv Motwani's wife. Late Professor Motwani was at Stanford, taught computer science here, and as you all know, he was the early DNA of Google, and Rajiv was one of the first few investors in PayPal, and we are based here in the Bay Area, and I, since year 2000 or so, between Rajiv and myself, we've invested in over 200 startups, mostly in the Bay Area, but some even in India. So my bread and butter, 80% of my work is venture capital, but about 20% of my work is now philanthropy in the last 20 years. Last 10 years or so, we've been doing mostly philanthropic work through the Motwani Jadeja Foundation. So you will see some of my own work coming up in, funding things in India, but also working on, some of the platforms like Pratham and Akshay Patra and things like that, where we are very closely involved. And that data that I get also is something that's, enormously helpful in my own venture capital investment. So I'm going to start here with, let's begin with, I think we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 people on the panel right now. So why don't we begin with Sarvir, then Archit, Bipin, and Gaurav. So go ahead, Sarvir, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your company, and the vision for post-pandemic world?
Sure. Thanks, Asha. My name is Saravir. I'm the CEO of Policy Bazaar. So Policy Bazaar is a digital insurance distribution platform. We are actually at this point the largest insurance distribution business in India, both online and offline. And our objective remains the same both pre and post pandemic. Our objective has always been to help the middle class of India protect themselves from death, disease, and disability. That's kind of why Policy Bazaar was started, and that's what we remain focused on. We believe that the middle class in India, there is no social security or a secure social security net in India. So the biggest problems that families go through are either due to the death of a wage earner, of the chief wage earner, or because of some unexpected hospitalization. And as I'm sure most of us know, a hospitalization can be very, very expensive today. And the family gets stuck. You don't know what to do. You can't give up, nor can you go forward. So we believe that insurance is the best way to do it. Historically, in insurance in India has been mixed with investment, which is a very inefficient way of insuring yourselves. We focus on the protection side of the business. What it means is that you pay a premium, you don't necessarily get anything back, but if you're hospitalized, the bill is taken care of, or if the person dies, you get a payoff. So that's really been our focus. I think COVID has made this whole thing even more important. It's helped our business to some extent, and we continue to drive this.
Okay. Archit?
Right. Asha, great to meet you, and hello, everybody. So ClearTax is like India's largest tax platform. We help consumers similar to TurboTax, like in India, do their taxes online. And with India's largest reform for businesses, GST and e-invoicing, which just started in India, we are like providing businesses a software as a service platform to help them digitize their business and their invoices. This basically is bringing India into like a digital first like economy for transacting with businesses, because like with UPI and electronic invoicing, India is like really leapfrogging the world in terms of having both digital information on how businesses transact with each other and digital payments. So we are at the forefront of this and very focused on this problem. So overall, like we've helped millions of Indians on the consumer side, and millions of businesses do their taxes, optimize taxes, pay taxes. And now we are helping businesses do their invoices digitally. In the post-pandemic world, I think like what we've seen is the digitization focus has really increased on the business side. Like the SaaS platform is really being used like at a much higher scale because businesses are like given the pandemic, like have had fundamental behavior shift and are embracing the cloud. Traditional companies, which are like very Indian, like if you will, are now like very cloud first, and that's a big behavior change. And overall, as Asha mentioned, like the entire world becomes an opportunity for us, and that's like sort of the focus going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you just quick sort of break up between consumers versus businesses, and what within businesses also small, medium, and large? Just a quick break
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll talk about that very briefly. Like, so for consumers, right, like we started out as a platform for self-serve taxes, for millennials, and like they became our core base. And today, like we serve like millions of them. And after that, like what we did is like went into tax savings and investment optimization.
So just give us a breakup, Archit. Just give us a breakup. Like 80% is consumers, and then like 20% is business. Is that I'm just trying to get a flavor so that I can fashion my questions accordingly.
Yeah, got you. So I think like we have about 4 million Indian consumers on our platform who use us every year for taxes, and like we have like about 800,000 businesses who use us for like so this 80-20 ratio is about right, like in terms of small, medium, and large businesses. We serve like 1,500 of India's largest enterprises out of the top like say 10,000, and like the rest all is like medium and small businesses. The 800,000.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Bipin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bipin. I am the co-founder and CEO of MobiKwik. We started off as a consumer wallet in India, and we have more than 120 million users, as well as we've built a merchant network of more than 3 million. And over the last 2.5, 3 years, especially since demonetization, we saw significant growth in digital payments. And we played a key part in getting customers to adopt digital payments in a big way, both customers and merchants. But what we saw is one big missing opportunity is the fact that there is very little penetration of financial services still, even though banking and payments are taking off in a big way. So we are currently focused over the last 3 years to build an integrated credit model on top of payments by using the kind of alternate data that we generate from the payment platform and use it to underwrite customers and introduce them to credit for the first time. And in that respect, what we do is quite similar to companies like Affirm or Klarna that you might be familiar with in US, but we are doing it in a much more granular fashion, given the kind of use cases we support. So essentially what we like to call as a digital credit card for the next 100 million population. In India, only 30 million people have credit cards. And so we believe there is a huge opportunity to utilize the digital footprint that is being created over the last 4-5 years, and it's accelerating, and use it to power financial services, especially credit. And so we've almost have more than 15 million customers to whom we have pre-approved credit, which is more than companies like Klarna or Affirm in the US. And we think that this is something that can continue over the next 10 years.
Is most of your Bipin, most of your customer base urban, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some percentage which is rural, but yeah, I would say 60% plus would be still urban. But these people are not your typical India one. These are not people who are on this panel. These are typically the kind of customers who are either self-employed, either it's a small shopkeeper, which is millions of shopkeepers in the country using MobiKwik app to pay their bills or to do shopping, or it could be somebody who's salaried, but they don't work for an Infosys or any technology company. They work for a private company somewhere in a tier 2, tier 3 town. So if you see the breakup, this is essentially called as India 2, or the bottom half of India 1. So when you split India into 3 stacks, India 1, India 2, India 3, all of us fall within the top half of India 1, which is the top 50 million people of India. So there is a huge opportunity in India specifically, not just in credit, but also in insurance, as like Sarbvir was talking about, to get micro financial services, credit, insurance, wealth management to the masses who today have a smartphone and are creating a very strong digital footprint. So that's what we are going after.
And you don't run into, actually, I'll come back to you. I do have a few questions on this. Okay, Gaurav, you are next. You are on a mute right now. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so thanks for having me here. So I run India's largest crypto exchange. It goes by the name BitBNS. So BNS stands for buy and sell, Bitcoin buy and sell. And we have a Bitcoin SIP product that we launched last year. So that was the world's first Bitcoin dollar cost averaging or an SIP product that we launched. Now, when we kind of look at from a crypto standpoint, right? Crypto fundamentally questions the very definition of money as to what money stands for, right? And what do you attribute money as? And over a period of time, what we've kind of realized is that people in India, right? For example, a lot of them kind of save their money in rupees. And over a period of time, that rupee has gotten devalued, right? So 12 years back, $1 US was about 39 to 40 rupees. Now it is 74, 75, right? So even if you doubled your money, your purchasing power of money has reduced. And that's where we're kind of building out solutions for users where they can effectively invest and kind of grow their wealth and kind of ensure that kind of does not recede with any sort of inflationary pressure or something that is happening. So with COVID, we have seen there has been a lot of excessive quantitative easing that has kind of happened, and that is kind of weakening even the US dollar right now, and also kind of currencies globally. And right now, we are already operating in 5 countries. So we operate in India, UAE, Indonesia, Thailand. And we are expanding it in a couple of more countries. So crypto as a whole is kind of inherently global in the way it kind of operates. Like every single asset, crypto asset can be transferred seamlessly across the world. And we're seeing how exactly the definition of money is changing for a lot of newbie or the millennials or Gen Z sort of people in terms of how they attribute money or how they kind of classify money as.
Gaurav, let me actually, now that you are here, let me ask you. So is it true that India simply does not have we simply don't have that kind of a, or is sort of cryptocurrency illegal in India right now? Is that true?
No, so crypto is not illegal in India. What happened in 2018 was a banking restriction that came from the RBI, which is more like a ring fencing approach that entities under the purview of RBI cannot deal with crypto entities in any form. And that ruling was overturned in March by the Supreme Court of India. So now it is perfectly fine for a user to kind of trade, invest, hold, or mine cryptocurrencies. And we've seen things kind of exploding. So before March, before the Supreme Court decision kind of came in, we're doing about roughly around 5 crores of volume in a day, and now that volume has kind of gotten close to about 150 crores a day in a span of about 8 to 9 months. And we're seeing the appetite to be kind of really, really high around crypto. And if things kind of get better on the regulatory side, for which we're kind of talking with some of these regulators through IAMI and other forums, I think that would kind of bring in a large flow of users into crypto in general.
Yeah, okay. As we proceed into this conversation, this is actually, first of all, I must say thank you all for being on this panel. This is just probably going to be one of the most interesting conversations that I've seen in a recent few months right now. But one of the things I just want you to know that I've actually lost my video for some reason, but I'll get back to it. But let me go back to Sarbvir for a second. Sarbvir, looks like right now you guys have almost 90% market share in Policy Bazaar, right? And I don't know who are your closest competitors, but how worried are you that there might be some startups, in the woodworks that could be coming and eating into your first mover advantage? And if so, what do you see? What do you see cooking in the horizon that gives you discomfort at night, even though you have a large market share right now?
Yeah, so I think Asha, we don't look at our market share anymore in the digital domain. I think it's sort of delusional to keep looking at it only from a digital way and feeling good about the fact that we have 90% market share. I think that is not something that we spend even 1 minute inside the company discussing. We look at our goal, as I mentioned, in a very holistic way, which is to focus on protection for the middle class. And right now we are a small speck in the whole, overall industry, if you were to look at it, right? The life industry in India is 100,000 crores a year of fresh premium. The, GI industry is another 25-30,000 crores of fresh premium. So for us, we are a small speck in that. We are, at about 5,000 crores of premium. We are a small speck in this whole game. So to be very clear, we definitely do not behave, act, or culturally think of ourselves as having any kind of dominance. We not only are worried about the startups, as you correctly said, there is always somebody else out there who is hoping to eat your lunch, right? So I think our focus is very much on the consumer. We see a very big opportunity for us. And honestly, our competitors are banks. I mean, large banks like HDFC Bank or Axis or ICICI, these are our competitors. Agents, physical agents who have been dealing in this business for, decades are our competitors. So we don't really think of it as startups alone. And I think really we focus on the consumer. We are trying to solve real consumer problems. Education is one of them. So if you ask me, our biggest challenge is education. We have to explain to people why you should buy. See, India has grown up on buying endowment policies, right? Whatever we know about insurance is this whole idea of putting some money and getting some money 10, 15, 20 years later. So what we are trying to break is that whole notion. We are trying to explain that this is to protect yourself, not just a saving instrument. So I think that's a real thing. Just to give you a sense, we've spent over $200 million over the last 10 years in advertising, in explaining to people why, buying these sorts of insurance is important. So I think that's really our focus. I think competition is always important, but I think the bigger prize is to, look at what is the opportunity in India.
And how fast do you expect the growth to happen? Do you expect that, because this is such a badly needed service in India, how fast do you expect for you guys to be having a significant footprint in the country?
So I think there are two ways of looking at it. I think if you look at in any industry in India, the statistics, are always show that we are highly underpenetrated. We are always a small fraction of China or whichever country you want to pick. So I think all of that is true in insurance as well. We have been ourselves growing at about 50-60% a year, over the last 10 years or so. Obviously, as you become larger, putting up those kind of numbers is harder. But we believe that at least for the next 5 years, that kind of performance is possible. That will still not mean anything much from an overall, penetration of insurance in India perspective, unfortunately. But that's the way it is. I think in India, one cannot get confused by these macro numbers. I think we have to go one by one. You have to look at the segment that you're in. As I think Bipin was explaining, there's India 1, India 2, and there are probably India 10s actually. And you've got to, slice it and work your way around it. So that's what we see. We see a huge runway of growth, as probably for any other Indian business. And like you said, it's almost a mission for us, right? That you got to focus on getting the people convinced, explained, and hopefully then they will buy from us. We are actually okay if they buy from somebody else to begin with. That's also
sure. And that's fine too. I think you're right that it educates the consumer into what is insurance and what are the pros and cons about it. One question that I have for you, Sarbvir, is about the Indian regulatory system. What kind of obstacles or opportunities you are running into? Is the Indian, the sort of the regulatory system kind of streamlined enough to help you guys grow, to help companies which are good for the country to grow in that space? How do you find that? And how do you deal with it if there are obstacles?
Surprisingly, with regulatory world, everyone's face is lit up.
Yes, I know, right? Yes, but and feel free to tell us honestly, because I think these forums are really places where we need to put our our thoughts on the table, because I think at least from sitting in the Bay Area, when I look at the regulatory system in India, I'm looking at how some of my startups are facing regulation in India. Some of the regulations are they are old, they are archaic, they don't belong there, and I personally find that when I try to reach the PM's office and try to get them to sort of rethink some of these regulations, unfortunately, we also do have a bureaucracy that is sitting there, which has been used to having regulatory system in certain way, feeling protective about people and so on. And that's something that is, I think India will need to surmount its regulatory system in order for us to be a truly global player. And I really do feel that we don't have a choice right now. We do have an aggressive China at our borders. And as a nation, if we don't, if we don't make our regulatory system much more entrepreneur friendly, we are going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. So that said, feel free to put all your cards on the table. I think this is a good forum for that. So sir, we'll start.
Yeah. So, look, I think the way to think about it is that the regulatory system in insurance is an important part of the industry. Okay. So I think we can say whatever we want, but the reality is that insurance, you collect the money upfront. There is a promise that is being made. The money is the impact is later. So I think it is very important that there be a regulatory system, and it has to be very robust, because otherwise, all kinds of things can happen, and it can destroy consumer trust, forever. So I think regulation is needed. I do think, as probably many of us on this panel would agree, I think the regulations have to keep pace with time. Regulators try to do a good job. It's not easy from them also. They get a lot of, alternate inputs from various, I would say, interested parties. And I think and that is a challenge for us also. I think, just to give you a sense, I think IRDA has been very, very proactive in COVID. So they came out and said, all COVID, cases will be covered by health insurance, which was a great step, because that solved the whole problem that, otherwise everyone was worried about it. They came up with standard policies. Again, a brilliant step for a country like India. The challenge comes when you mix business models. You see, the problem now is that who is an insurance company, who is an insurance distributor, who is a mutual fund distributor, who's a tax player, who's in cryptocurrency. These borders are going away, right? Our customers don't necessarily care. Like, our customers buy insurance from MobiKwik also, right? So the problem for us is that in India, we still are not able to look beyond these buckets. So if we are an insurance distributor, we have to follow insurance distributor rules, right? Which unfortunately can sometimes restrict our ability to serve our customers. So, we always explain this to even to the regulator many times, that Amazon is allowed to do many different things, right? But why are we not allowed to do those things, right? Why can't we offer our services like a maybe even money wallet to our customers, if we, if it makes sense, or tax or something? But we are restricted from doing that, So I think if one thing we could wish for, and not getting into smaller issues, but one thing we could wish for is this slightly different mindset, which suggests that let's allow people, let there be principle based regulation across the board, right? That this is not allowed, this is allowed. But once something is allowed, let it not be said that if you're an insurance aggregator, you can only do X, and if you are a tax person, you can only do Y. Let people do things which are allowed, and on principle basis, rather than being very pedantic around, this percent commission is allowed and that percent commission is not allowed. After all, we are dealing with large insurance companies, right? I think they don't need to be protected from a small startup in insurance. So, but again, that's, I think, if you were to ask me, that is one big thing, that focus on principles rather than on, minutiae of, small things around defined by some, historical precedent.
So let's go to MobiKwik for that, please, on that question. As companies like Amazon, for example, come into India and start having a very strong presence here, do you feel that, and since you find that the regulators allow companies like Amazon and others to do multiple set of things and not be restricted to one regulatory vertical, right? Do you think that there's a learning happening in the regulatory, in the ecosystem of regulation? Do you see that there's a learning going on, where you find people in the government saying, okay, no, we are learning from this foreign entity here that this is how things can be done better, more streamlined? Do you find that kind of is there a learning going on, Bipin? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a lot actually going on in terms of regulation in India. I think I would say the pace of regulation across the board, across payments, across insurance, across credit or digital lending, across data, across identity, across tax has been changing massively over the last 4 or 5 years. I think if you go back to 2015, you may not recognize the country in which we were operating in terms of regulation. I think regulation has definitely changed. In many cases, actually, it has changed faster than we could adapt to. So I actually have a reverse complaint that it probably changes too fast for companies to build a business model. Sometimes you're building a wallet, sometimes there is a UPI, at other times there is a market cap on UPI. So it's just a lot of things changing. I think the reason for worry that I have is I don't know who is in control of regulation, who's really even driving it, because like Sabir was also mentioning, there doesn't seem to be consensus at the very top in terms of how to drive regulation forward. And that means that
is it typically actors like SEBI and RBI, and are those the players that setting the agenda for regulation?
Yeah, so they are all responsible for the regulation and implementation, but I think they also probably look for direction, and they look for data, and like you were saying, and not just Amazon, they will look at fintech companies, Policybazaar, they will look at ClearTax, they will look at crypto, they will look at MobiKwik and see what is happening, and they have been changing things, but I think the things have also been changing too fast, too granular, and too piecemeal. I think things in terms of, like Sabir was saying, like I think in a digital world, a lot of these differences are really very artificial, because a customer is on your platform. So what can he do? Can he buy insurance? Can he make payments? Can he open a bank account? Simply, can he open a digital bank account, right? Or can he open he or she get a crypto wallet? So I think overall, I feel that so what happens because of this piecemeal kind of regulation is there are definitely different lobbies, right? And those lobbies try to drive their own agenda. And I would say that fintech companies. Sorry, so fintech companies, of course, have their own lobby. Everybody wants to do what they want to do. Banks have their own lobbies, strong lobbies. Foreign large corporations have their own lobbies. All of this, in my view, has created some form of a khichdi right now in terms of regulation. It is moving forward, but I think it would really be good for somebody to, some technocrat really, to sit down and look at and build consensus across the board and move sort of policy, broader policy, regulatory policy in financial services together, right? I'm sure you noticed, like, three large banks of the country had their systems down for the first 3 days of this month, right? These are the leading private sector banks in the country. This included SBI as well, which is the largest bank in the country. Uh, so we are, while creating this kind of complex regulation and while traffic is growing, more and more customers are using smartphones, transactions start failing, it creates confusion and loss of trust. And in my view, that's a big danger, because we are very far away from achieving any form of penetration, significant penetration in the form of digital payments and digital financial services. And the first thing that we need to protect is consumer trust. And like, the systems have to work, the systems have to be scalable. So if you ask me, for example, right, I mean, if like Singapore has just shown innovation in terms of allowing 2 digital banking licenses recently to a couple of entities and a wholesale banking license, I think we need to think 5 years, 10 years in advance. I feel that the regulatory thinking today is very much incremental. It is looking at what we have today and move one step forward, which has been the typical, India policy also for many of the things. You would know that, we measure every step and move forward. But in this respect, countries like China are obviously moving far faster ahead. I mean, in terms of their progress, you look at, they're talking about a digital currency, and they probably will be the first digital currency issued by any country, digital cryptocurrency issued by any country in the world. So I think there's a lot that can be done on the regulatory side, but it needs, and I can go on for a long time, but
So
it needs more broader.
No, let me just pick up on what you just said, Vipin. You said something about the fact that if there was a bunch of technocrats who were in charge on the top, you're saying that right now it seems to be slightly amorphous. Like, who's in charge of this whole regulatory framework, which can allow our startups to be really blossoming into global players? Mind you, it's critical that sooner or later, all of you will have to be thinking much more in global terms, I think. But in terms of you just mentioned something about sort of technocrats. You said that it looks like that there doesn't seem to be some kind of an authority up there, which is technically also savvy enough to say, here is what we can be, here is what, this would look like 5 years or 10 years from now if we were to implement these particular constraints in the system now. When you say technocrats, so let me go to Archit here. Arjit, if we had to pick, right, if we had a dream scenario where we had technocrats helping out on the government front, I mean, what kind of people are we looking at? Are we looking at people like Nandan Nilekani and people like that who are, let's say, older, more, maybe some might be even retiring at some point, right? These people, I would say, in my book, these people are a gold mine for India, because these guys, if they were working hand in hand with the government, they could truly be streamlining regulation or making it more agile, just making it more dynamic so that it flows with the time and it flows with what's like Bipin just mentioned about China potentially coming up with the first digital currency. If we should not be running far behind, to be honest. So if we had these technocrats who were working hand in glove with the government, give me some sense. What would these technocrats be looking? I mean, who would they look like?
Right. So I think, like, great point, Asha, and Bipin, I think the overall having the right brain trust or the think tanking, if you will, coming from the right set of people is obviously good input is equal to good output. Now, few things I want to quickly address because, I just want to make sure, one is the Indian ecosystem has to have the right sort of intent, right? Like, in the sense of I think the government has to be, or the regulator has to think less punitively, and as Sarbir said, more in terms of principles and sort of operating guidelines and a philosophy as a country. And over then the technocrats can lay down the rails and the regulatory framework in which to operate. Now, if the approach, and we've seen this in taxes, and we've seen this in, if the approach is like the citizen or the company which is trying to innovate, they are potentially at fault, or you don't trust them, or if it's a low trust society or a low trust ecosystem, then even when the technocrats come in, then they can't change the frame in which we operate as a country. So I think like first we have to decide like our identity as a, in this space, like as what you were mentioning, right? If you're thinking global first, right? Like, let me give a couple of examples, and like I'll come back and address the question that you talked about. Like incorporating a company, like we on the ClearTax platform, entrepreneurs can incorporate a company, get started. Like we help hundreds and thousands of entrepreneurs every month build their start their company, set up ESOP plans, and so on and so forth. It is still easier to do a Singaporean company, for example, and comply with their regulations than to do an Indian entity and comply with Indian entity regulations. ESOPs, etc., are much easier over there. Corporate governance policy systems are easier. Tax systems are easier, cleaner to deal with, like in terms of like just having a single rate, like multiple simplicity. In India, like I think GST has been a massive reform, and income taxes like continue to get better every year. I think like when I look back like over a decade, like India has definitely made progress. And as Vipin was saying, like from 2015 to now, like you would come to a different country. So that's like the magic of India. I think like that is very, very impressive. We have digitized like we digitize 2 billion invoices a year as a country. Like we digitize every single business invoice above a certain revenue threshold. So I think we do a lot as a country. I think we, and these were brought in by technocrats. I mean, the GST framework had Nilekani committee advising. The Aadhaar framework was obviously Nandan and team. UPI had a lot of influence from some of these like trusted and like maybe financially indifferent at this point. Like they've made enough money. They're out of the like day to day, and they can have national impact and focus is on the nation. But I think like if the operating framework moves to, we will trust our citizens, we will trust these operating entities, and if things go wrong, like the guidelines and the policy will serve us rather than like punitive measures or being one step ahead and thinking 5-year or 10-year horizon is the main thing that we should fix. I think the technocrats can then operate and lay down the guardrails and lay down the operating frameworks and the railways.
So when you guys become billionaires, do you expect to be playing that role? I hope, God be willing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think like what I see is like, we need less regulation as a country. I mean, we need like, I think we need like the guidelines, and we need like systems and checks and balances. But I think overall, I think I understand where the regulator comes from. It's a complex country to govern, and as the gentleman mentioned, like it's India 1, India 2, India 10, and to protect like India 9 and 10, you may have to do measures which are like averse to India 1 or innovation. So I think those things matter. But I think like fundamentally, I think we should put a stake in the ground and say like, and we can achieve that. Like, right? Why is India not equal to like, let's say Singaporean regulations? Like, what does it take? And let's just get there. And like then I think like then we can work backwards from okay, these are the 5 things stopping us, and like that.
So let me ask you, Archit, why would you not pack up your bags and incorporate your company in Singapore? Why would you not do that?
Yeah, unfortunately, like we are incorporated, like we have a dual structure. We have a US entity and an Indian entity, and like the Indian entity is a subsidiary, and like and so it is unfortunate. I mean, like we have like a lot of instances of a Singaporean and Indian entity. We do that work for the entrepreneurs who are getting started. I think like from an equity structure, like multiple investors find it easier to invest in like Singaporean or American entities. The corporate, the Delaware corporation laws and like the governance structures and the Delaware courts have very strong clarity, and like so does Singaporean system. So I think like those lead to like global capital flowing in these structures and rather than Indian structures, and slowly it'll get better. But like I think if as you said, like if we have to build global companies from day zero faster, we have to provide these. Like I'm just not happy.
I think that's, you know what, I think that's where the mindset of the people who are running the country is going to have to change, which is to say we need to bring the money back into our country. Otherwise, some of our top talent is going to be leaving the country, setting up companies in a foreign land. And then if those companies exit, a lot of that liquidity, the liquidity will be remaining outside and not be entering into the Indian coffers. And we need to start thinking about how to increase the size of, if Modi government is really serious about increasing the size of the Indian pie from 3 trillion to 5 trillion, as Modi and team talk about, we will have to be cognizant of the fact that our entrepreneurs will need to bring in the money from outside. That huge amount of capital inflow can happen only if we know that we are going to make it easy for our companies to be globally competitive.
And I
Gaurav,
think
what do
like,
you think? I think given that you are in the crypto space, have you found that that you have a preference for? Have you incorporated abroad also, just like just like ClearTax?
So, so our brush with regulators started right even at the time of incorporating the entity. So we're not getting an NC approval for even incorporating the entity, that you cannot operate a crypto business and everything. And this was even before the RBI banking restriction came in. And we then had to kind of declare it something like software and services and managed to incorporate it. And then at the end of it, change the MOA and AOA. And eventually then the banking restriction came in, and we tried kind of liaising with all of these regulators and said, crypto is something like you cannot stop a technology whose time has come. You cannot potentially kind of stop something like this. You will have to better regulate it. Otherwise, there would be a lot of financial frauds also that can happen. And if you do not have things in place to kind of combat something like this, you do not have proper regulations in place, it's going to be a lot more difficult to even punish the bad actors. And we're kind of willing to give them real-time dashboards in terms of how much transactional activity is happening, if there is any suspicious transaction reports, all those sort of stuff. So we already comply with like 65-70% of the norms that are given to, say, equity brokers or whatever norms say SEBI gives across to all of these sort of retail brokers. But we've seen that there is sort of a lag. They see that if we probably would kind of just copy across a playbook when some of the other countries kind of start implementing stuff. We might have an option to kind of copy that playbook rather than kind of probably trying something like a sandboxing approach or anything of that sort. And till that point in time, we'll try and kind of cut off the oxygen. Like in case of any fintech company, if you don't have a bank account, you're basically cutting off the oxygen that would be out there for that entity, right? So that was there. So we kept operating in India for a couple of years, and what started happening was there was a lot of misconception that was there in the minds of people, including the law enforcement. So even policemen, even banking professionals didn't know. They thought Bitcoin is illegal and banned. It was not banned or illegal. It was just that RBI said, entities under my purview cannot deal with it. And there were a couple of actual arrests that happened, and CEO of some of the Bitcoin exchanges had to spend time in jail for about a week or so. And that's when we decided that at least we'll need to kind of incorporate it outside India. And we come from, say, an institute, right? From IIT has that thing, like IIT Kharagpur at least had that it is dedicated to the service of the nation. Every day we used to kind of go to classes, and we used to kind of see that it is dedicated to the service of the nation. And we frankly kind of feel that we should kind of contribute something of that sort. And that's precisely that sort of a role that we wanted to kind of play. But eventually we became helpless. Like if you yourself cannot protect your own yourself, then you'll at least have to kind of find out a solution to that. So we eventually moved to Singapore, incorporated that, have a holdco structure, and have an entity in India. But it is unfortunate, like that's not something that we wanted to do, but eventually we had to kind of go about with it.
Got it. How many of you all have been funded by foreign venture capital? Raise your hand. Both of you? Okay. Okay.
All of us.
All of you.
All of us. Yeah.
All of you. Wow. And is there any kind of in India, is there any kind of I know that in my own venture capital cohort, Sequoia and Axel and all of them have offices in Bombay, Delhi, and other places. And I do see them, actively engaging and investing in India, and including, we have even Chinese VCs coming in now. So there's no doubt about it. And I think Do you think that's a positive? Is that, and if so, how has it helped you? Let's start with you, Sarvjit, as to what is the value of having a foreign venture capitalist investing in your company, and how do you see that unfolding as you go forward into your next stage of Policy Bazaar?
Yeah, so Asha, for us, it has been a very interesting experience because for till last year, we actually had this regulation that only 51% of our company always had to be held by Indian investors. So we had this always dilemma that if we got a foreign investor, we had to find an Indian investor. The history of Policy Bazaar is that, you know, Info Edge was the first investor, and in fact, they took a large stake in the beginning and they put up a reasonable amount of capital. So we never actually had a huge problem with that rule, but it did mean that every time we used to keep, you know, having to find Indian. So we have a lot of shareholders. So for what is a private company, we have a surprisingly large number of shareholders because, you know, each time and we have SoftBank, Tencent, you know, Temasek. So we have a Wellington. We have a large number of foreign investors. Tiger was an investor till very recently. So we have all these people, but each time we brought somebody in, you also had to balance the, you know, books and make sure that. So we have a lot of small family offices, large, you know, people involved in our cap table. Now that, if you ask me honestly, that is an unnecessary, you know, what do you call it, work that has to go on because, you know, at the end of the day, capital is capital, and you know, it is. But again, to the credit of the regulators and the country, it was finally fixed last year, and now we are away from this. Now, see, in India, there are already a large number of funds which are active. So Sequoia India, you know, to be honest, is reasonably Indian as well. I mean, I would not say that necessarily that they are foreign or even Accel.
But technically, Sarvjit, is Sequoia India considered an Indian fund, or is it an Indian investor or a foreign investor?
No, it is considered a foreign investor because they all have offshore entities which, you know, put in the capital in India. I'm saying the people you deal with are fairly, you know, are part of the ecosystem. But we have, you know, larger players like SoftBank and all who are our investors. And definitely one thing that, and honestly, it's not necessarily Indian versus foreign, but I think it's just that the capital, the scale of capital that comes in, they are looking for scale outcomes, right? So the things that interest them are different from things that may interest others. And I think that has been one of the, I would say one of the learnings for us also, is that as you go up the ladder and you get these larger institutions in, you have to be, you know, cognizant of that their outcome expectations are very different. And, you know, they have certain ways of thinking. And I mean, like you've been saying, right, from the beginning of this panel, that we have to think beyond India and, you know, be sort of global. So I think a lot of some of those kind of, I would say, thoughts, the kind of things saying, you know, why are you doing this? If this is not going to become a scale business, even in your planning horizon, then should we be doing this at all or not? So some of those things come in.
Do you get enough hand holding, Sarvjit? Do you get enough hand holding from your VCs, from your foreign VCs into hand holding you towards more of a global, you know, of course, you already have a large market in India, but in order for you to be going global, do you see that kind of hand holding coming from your foreign investors?
Honestly, Asha, I may be in a minority, but I don't think that investors need to handhold, you know, companies. I think, you know, their job is to provide capital. And I think, you know, maybe provide some kind of direction once in a while. Right. I think, you know, entrepreneurs, management teams, hopefully they back the right people who should know what they're doing. So I don't expect, you know, investors to be playing that role, but I would say that our investors have played a very strong role in, you know, setting guardrails, guiding, you know, making sure that, you know, you're not sort of veering off in some wrong direction or whatever. But yeah, beyond that, I think it's fine. I think we, you know, the money is the most important thing, and, you know, the rest can be managed.
That's true. Archit, what do you think?
I think domestic capital, like there's not enough domestic capital for like high risk, high reward ventures in India right now. I feel when we also got started, like I remember like I'd moved back from the Bay Area and we started ClearTax, and the first capital infusion came in from the Bay Area. I mean, we became the first Y Combinator company to be funded in India, and subsequent to that, like Sequoia and Founders Fund and some Bay Area folks invested. So what I've realized over time is like, I think risk capital is coming from folks who have seen returns, outsized returns, right? And where have people seen outsized returns is where like the venture industry has been successful. And typically that's the Silicon Valley. And those are the like sort of offshoots you see like of Accel or Sequoia, like they have outposts in these Israel, India, China, what have you, right? Like depending on the size of the firm. So I think like it continues to be relevant, I think, at seed and seed and like further stages to have like expertise and VC like sort of funds and focus. I think private equity travels the whole world. I think we have seen that like private equity is has invested in like our banking, our financial services, our insurance sector, like traditionals, like manufacturing and so on and so forth. So I think that is analogous to a startup, right? I think there's not much difference as long as like I think sometimes X country capital is considered dirty by the regulator, sometimes not. Like, and so those kind of things keep changing. And
But
if the capital doesn't come,
it's a 51% rule, sort of keeping you guys, pulled down a little bit.
oh, it's not. Yeah, so it's not applicable to our kind of companies. Like we're a software company, and in that sense, like, so I think like it applies to like it was most serious in the insurance sector. I think other sectors are less impacted by these kind of.
Okay.
But I think like overall, there's a general move to. I think there's a general recognition that like capital infusion is okay and welcome. And I think overall, like we've seen like the guardrails have come down even in insurance, right, over time. I think the regulator understands and recognizes that. So overall, I think like there's been a recent like what do you call discomfort with Chinese capital over the last like
Yes.
6 months, 1 year with the border tensions and what have you. So I think that may continue, but otherwise, like I think capital which is considered clean would flow into India. I think it's a good thing overall. I don't see a downside because it nurtures the first set of entrepreneurs. Like for example, like Flipkart had an exit, right? Now Sachin and Binny, for example, and the first set of the first 20-50 employees of Flipkart can become like liquidity originators, just like the erstwhile Intel did, or the erstwhile like the Fairchild
Totally.
Semiconductor did. Like, so I think like that kind of thing like leads to, because these guys are venture guys now, like because they have like outsized returns in their like early 30s, right? Like, so now you can see like them investing or us investing, this panel investing for the next generation, like, and that
No,
will be
there is
domestic capital.
I think there's a fabulously growing angel community in India now, and I'm really happy to see that there are angel groups in every city now, almost.
Yeah,
MobiKwik,
absolutely.
Bipin, are you guys a direct competitor to Paytm?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I would like to see we compete in one part of what Paytm does, which is on
Okay.
payments. And I think they do a lot of other things, or they're known to do a lot of other things. But our focus is very sharp. We are focused on payments, and also we are focused on digital credit and financial services. So from that point of view, we are building business, I would say, in a slightly different way. Not a super app. We are not building a super app. We are building a fintech company, which is an enabler and partner for all kinds of commerce and all kinds of customers who need access to financial services. So I think that's
What is your dream scenario, Bipin? What is your own dream scenario for the next, in your book? What would be what is your next sort of goal that you are would be your dream scenario coming true?
Yeah, so I think our dream scenario is also what we are thinking actually in real time as well, which is that, referring to, for example, foreign capital and the fact that, foreign risk capital has been allowed in India, but has not yet seen returns at the same scale as a Silicon Valley or China have, right? I mean, yes, there is a Walmart, Flipkart exit and few others. But really speaking, there hasn't been much of exits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the real exits in US also happen not just by M&A, but also by IPO, right?
True.
And M&A is a much more recent kind of a phenomenon. So our dream scenario is to actually build a company much more publicly and, go list in the public markets.
In fact, my own, idea to you or suggestion to you, Bipin, would be all of you should be thinking of going IPO on NASDAQ. Really, as you grow, as your footprint grows in India and abroad, you guys should be listing. Indian companies have to list on NASDAQ now. And that's, in fact, just so you guys know, that's one of the battles that I'm fighting right now in Delhi, which is to find out what are the obstacles to our companies listing on NASDAQ. We have to go public on Wall Street, and we have to bring in the money back. And before we have 2 minutes remaining from getting this thing from the tech person here. But my own dream scenario is that I get to invest in companies like you guys. That's going to be my own sort of low-hanging fruit and dream scenario. Please keep me in mind, okay, as you raise your next rounds and as you run into other startups that you think are looking for seed and first Series A kind of investing, please do suggest my name to them. I would love to be in the running. I've been a little bit slow in the last few months, in the last 1 year or so in India, but I need to pick up, because in the post-pandemic world, we have an unprecedented set of opportunities that Indian startups have if we can get our act together. So, with that, I'm going to just, Gaurav, I'm going to give you last few words about what is your own dream scenario that you want to see unfold in India for your own startup.
Right. So overall, with respect to crypto in general, what we are seeing is there is already a lot of adoption that is kind of coming through. One is kind of clear set of guidelines, so people can kind of invest without any sort of fear, and we kind of see that scaling up it up to 100 million users over the next couple of years. How do we kind of scale it around? And if we bring that set of users into crypto as a whole would kind of substantially grow from wherever it is right now. So that's kind of the dream scenario, and hoping forward that it kind of works out.
Okay, well, you know what? We are out of time now. So I want to thank you all for being on this panel. This has been one of the most interesting and lively panels I've been on recently. Thank you for being here, and please stay in touch now.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you.